So, we all know by now that the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime is doing wonderful things for Uryu's character. What should have always been his arc in the manga, and ostensibly was meant to be his arc in the manga, was instead a painful display of complete inaction and wasted potential, with Uryu barely being involved at all, despite his seeming betrayal and defection to the Vandenreich being a huge plot point. Well, thanks to the major sweeping changes being made by the anime, that is no longer an issue. And in fact, Uryu may very well be the single most transformed character in the final arc as a result. Thanks to these changes, Uryu has more fights, more feats, and more relevance than ever, including perhaps the most overt change of all, a brand new Quincy Vollstandig, something that was never even hinted at in the manga, but always made perfect sense for the character. Well, in today's video, I want to take a look at Uryu's incredible new power and the new abilities he's demonstrated in the anime so far, as well as dive a little deeper into some of them. After all, these aren't just some superficial new additions thrown in to please the hardcore fanbase. No, Uryu's new abilities have helped to shape the trajectory of the anime really from Core 3 onwards, including helping him go as far as to kill a member of the Zero Division. So, without further ado, let's take a look. What exactly are some of these new powers, and how are they being used, and what do they mean for Uryu as a character now in Core 3 and beyond? Before we get started, as always, consider hitting subscribe down below if you haven't done already for more Bleach videos just like this every single week. We're trying to hit 300,000 subs by the end of the year, and I really can't do it without your help, so please do consider hitting subscribe down below, and also check out my Patreon as well, where you can get every single video just like this, but without any YouTube ads, along with everyone who is supporting the channel right now over on Patreon. It does make a massive difference, and it is greatly appreciated, so thank you all so very much. And of course, before we get into this video, there will be some spoilers for the remainder of the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime still to come, so be wary of that. Look, while Uryu manages virtually nothing in the manga, the Uryu of the anime has achieved an awful lot by comparison. After drinking Yhwach's blood and having a shrift engraved into his soul, Uryu actually becomes a Quincy worthy of the moniker of heir to the Vandenreich. I know, I can scarcely believe it. In chapter 543, when Yhwach announces Uryu's ascension to the rest of the Sternritter, he tells them they will soon see for themselves Uryu's power on the battlefield. And in the manga, that never happened. But in the anime, at the very least, the Schutzstaffel have indeed seen Uryu's capabilities firsthand, and in some very impressive and varied ways. And I guess to some extent, Sternritter like Kangdu and BG9 also saw what Uryu could do, considering he seems to beat them up when he collects them for execution. Uryu now has access to a litany of either completely new abilities that were introduced in the anime, or improved upon versions of existing abilities that were seen in the manga, where they've either been expanded upon or given wholly new showings entirely that completely change the context around them. And we're going to start with one such ability. First up, there's Uryu's incredibly powerful and, frankly, broken shrift, the Antithesis. On paper, the Antithesis is a fairly simple ability. Uryu can select two targets and reverse anything that has already happened between them. In the manga, we only ever see Uryu use the Antithesis once, and it comes very late into the game, during his battle with Hashwolf, in fact. In chapter 679, so 7 chapters from the end of Bleach, Uryu reveals his shrift for the first time by reversing all of the injuries the two of them have received throughout their fight so far. So the Antithesis doesn't only reverse positions in the moment, Uryu can reverse anything that has happened between 2 points, presumably within an indeterminate amount of time. But anyway, since Uryu was lying broken, covered in blood, and near death, the use of the Antithesis made it so that Hashwolf suddenly received said wounds, all of them immediately inflicted upon him at once in a bloody barrage, while Uryu was miraculously healed, as Hashwolf hadn't suffered a single hit to date in their fight. So the Antithesis is one of the few abilities of Uryū's that does actually appear in the manga, albeit extremely briefly. In the anime though, the Antithesis has already shown up a couple of times, even though it's yet to be explicitly revealed and named. Uryū uses the Antithesis to reverse the positions of both Yhwach and a medallion, as the Quincy King launches said medallion into the air, to then swap places with it, escaping Hikafune's Cage of Life, which doesn't happen in the manga. Then, later on, Uryū uses the Antithesis in an even more overt way in his duel against Senjumaru. Although Senjumaru manages to overwhelm and capture Uryū using her bankai, which, by the way, I liked, because it shows that were it not for Uryū's broken shrift, he would likely still lose in a straightforward fight with the Zero Division member, despite getting a buff from Yhwach's the Almighty activating. Uryū then uses the Antithesis to reverse their positions, having Senjumaru ensnared by her own bankai instead of him. This leaves her wide open to a direct hit from one of Uryū's arrows, with which he kills her with a shot through the heart, which again is a massive change from the source material. It's interesting though, going back to the idea I mentioned a minute ago, wherein the Antithesis can reverse things from any point in time between those two designated targets. Here we see that in action, as Uryū doesn't actually use the Antithesis itself to escape Senjumaru's bankai. In fact, he only uses his shrift to ensure that she can't escape his next attack. Instead, he actually breaks free of her bankai thanks to the sudden and unexpected awakening of his Quincy Vollstandig, which explodes into life, taking on an early and unstable form. Before we get to Uryū's Quincy Vollstandig, however, let's first touch on Uryū's basic Quincy skills and how they've been improved too, thanks to the anime. Uryū does use his signature move Licht Regen once in the manga version of the arc, whereas here in the anime it's used a few times in Uryū's new fights, which is pretty cool, but it's not like the properties of the ability are changed up too much. It's essentially just a rain of arrows. Speaking of changing properties though, regarding Uryū's actual Heilig file themselves, the anime has, I would say, kind of transformed the way this character's arrows truly feel. For starters, they are actually dangerous now. Uryū has seemingly become so powerful that once she could no longer escape, she could no longer dodge, all it took was a single well-placed arrow to outright kill Senjumaru, which feels, I don't know, kind of crazy to me. And again, it's not like this hasn't happened before. I mean, Uryū defeats Tsuruchi with a single shot through the chest as well. But this is a Zero Division member, and as far as we can tell, there's nothing particularly crazy about this arrow that he uses here. But here's the thing though. His Volstandig, although at this point incomplete, had awoken and was kind of active, and was presumably bolstering the power of his arrows. Which leads me to my next question, and we're going to get kind of into the weeds here. What's the power differential between the arrow that snipes Senjumaru and the arrow that Uryū uses to defeat Mayuri in the Soul Society arc? How much stronger is Volstandig Uryū compared with Let's Steal Uryū? Remember, Uryū doesn't defeat Mayuri in a single hit in the Soul Society arc. He actually fires 2 arrows from his Let's Steal. The first one really injures Mayuri, but he's still capable of then using bankai. It's the second arrow that takes him out. And so I would imagine the difference, I would say, should be considerable. Maybe, and that's on top as well of him drinking Yhwach's blood. But, conversely, his Volstandig isn't fully formed at this point either, so I don't know, this is a pretty roundabout way of simply saying that it feels like even Uryū's basic arrows have grown incredibly dangerous. Kirige Opi himself comments that Uryū's arrows can't possibly be weaker than his own, and that's before Uryū has even undergone the occult initiation, which is kind of weird thinking about it. In fact, Uryū's new battle with Ichigo presents us with an even more explicit comparison. I would say here, his Volstandig is now fully formed, save for a halo anyway, and he destroys Ichigo's side with a single arrow shot in a way that feels purposefully reminiscent of what happened to Mayuri. Later still, Uryū also snipes Renji directly through the chest with a single arrow as well, taking him out of the fight. Though I would argue that's a little more up in the air, as Renji had just suffered having nearly all of his strength drained. But Uryu's now much more capable with High League File in general, as we see him conjuring them without a bow in his battle with Ichigo. When dueling Ichigo up close, Uryu unleashes a wave of arrows from both his arms and legs, and then when he leaps into the sky, Uryu conjures a kind of not quite bow, it more just looks like an arc of reishi, with which he then uses Licht Regen. To be completely honest, with this new version of Uryu, although he does still use bows, and we'll talk about that in a second, the idea of a physical bow seems to have less importance than ever, and the character seems to utilize Quincy techniques in a much more free-form and fluid way. It's kind of cliche to say it, but it does almost feel like with this new power, Uryu himself has become the bow in many respects. Based on his fight with Ichigo, at least anyway. And having said that, linking us back to our High League File discussion we were having a moment ago, when Uryu prepares an arrow to finish off both Ichigo and Renji, he conjures a brand new physical bow with a new design. And look, Uryu has new bows in the manga version of the arc as well, but to be totally honest, they are completely all over the place and don't seem to have any bearing on his actual skill level or power whatsoever at the time. He conjures a brand new bow in the very final stages of his fight with Hashwolf and it does absolutely nothing. And speaking of utilising Heilig Borgin, Uryu does wield a fairly standard and nondescript bow at times, the same bow that he has for much of the Thousand Year Blood War arc in the manga, even using it to go toe-to-toe with Renji in close quarters combat, wielding it kind of like a sword, which is really cool, before transitioning, as I said, to the more decorated and bespoke bow at the end of their fight, which he uses to fire the decisive arrow, the same bow he used against Ichigo at the very end. Uryu's obviously extremely competent with Bloop Vein too, blocking Senjumaru's Hakuda, and even using it in a passive way to protect himself from rogue splashes of lava from her bankai. Perhaps even more impressively, Uryu's Bloop Vein is strong enough to the point where it almost entirely negates everything Renji's true Bankai saw Zabimaru can do, which actually seems a little crazy to me, especially when Renji uses that ultimate new attack of his and it does basically nothing to Uryu. That's a little... I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. But moving on, of course, the most significant change to Uryu's ability set comes in the form of his shiny new Quincy Vollstandig, something he simply did not have in the manga, despite it again seeming like the obvious move for his character. But then, Uryu basically didn't have any fights in the manga with which to make use of a Quincy Vollstandig, I suppose. Here, though, not only does Uryu get a holy form, but we actually get to see the progression of it as well, which we don't get to see from any other Sturmritter, which is pretty cool. Like, as I mentioned, the Volstandig awakens during Uryu's battle with Senjumaru as he finds himself on the brink of oblivion before the might of her Bankai. At this stage, the Volstandig emerges as an unstable energy force, crackling and exploding forth from Uryu's body like electricity. Once the power stabilizes somewhat, we can see an early rendition of what will eventually become Uryu's actual wings. And then, when Uryu battles Ichigo a few episodes later, he reveals the full extent of his Volstandig for the first time. Not just a pair of striking crystalline blue wings, but various other accoutrements as well, such as gauntlets which wrap around his forearms, similar wrappings around his legs which take the form of boots, and an emblem that sits on his chest in the shape of a military medal of sorts, all of which embody a sharp, angular, arrowhead or fletching-like theme. Curiously, Uryu's Volstandig does not possess a Heilig Schlein, or halo, which is weird since the halo is supposedly where the bulk of the Sternritter's divine power comes from, including their ability to use Sklaveri in the first place. And, so far at least, Uryu's Volstandig doesn't have a name either, at least not one we're aware of. Speaking of Sklaveri, something else that's peculiar is the fact that when Uryu activates his Volstandig against Ichigo, he's already utilising this decorated, completed version of the holy form straight out of the gate. However, when he battles Renji, Uryu wields a much more basic version of the Volstandig first, one that only has the wings, until he later uses Sklaveri to dominate the Reishi around them and empower his Volstandig, much in the same way many of the other Sturmritter do in the anime as well, transforming it into the version we see used against Ichigo. Presumably he felt he needed the fully powered version of his Volstandig again immediately against Ichigo, which obviously he does, whereas perhaps he underestimated Renji's true bankai in Varvelt. Though I would assume that against Ichigo is perhaps the first time he's ever actually used this version of his Volstandig, so I'm a little surprised by that, and also it's kind of weird that we don't see him use Sklaveri to activate it, so there's that. But I guess on that note, Uryu's Quincy Vollstandig is fascinating because the team has had to try and retrofit it into the arc, simultaneously attempting to make Uryu look and feel considerably, rightfully more powerful than he was in the manga, while also not totally breaking the scale. In his battle against Ichigo, there's no doubt that while impressive, Uryu appears to be on the back foot for almost the entire fight. Not because he's performing badly, he's not, he's aggressive, but because it's clear that Ichigo is not only in Shikai, but also barely trying. When it comes to their much shorter skirmish in the final episode of Core 3, which is I think 10 episodes after their initial fight, Ichigo is a little more tired of Uryu's nonsense at this point, and we see that he overpowers him pretty effortlessly, still using just Shikai. During their initial fight, once Ichigo manages to force Uryu to use his Volstandig, it might look like Uryu takes control of the battle, and in some sense he does, but in reality Ichigo, even in Shikai, is just considerably more powerful. But there is something I would say to be said for the fact Uryu is able to get as far as he does. With his Quincy Vollstandig active, Uryu's ability set changes up entirely. Now, his predominant method of attacking is to conjure a swarm of icy blue arrow-like darts, which he controls with his hand in a way that is very similar to Byakuya's Bankai Senbon Zakura Kageyoshi, moving this mass of projectiles all at once with an elegance and grace that conceals their true threat. These darts are extremely versatile, and despite having only just completed his Volstandig, Uryu demonstrates an incredible amount of skill with them. In his battle with Ichigo, Uryu conducts the flock of darts masterfully, and they are capable of being directed not only as projectiles themselves, but also of firing energy blasts from their tips as well, doubling up the number of projectiles Uryu is able to use. Now, I love that Uryu's Volstandig is themed around projectiles in general. Way back when, before his shrift was even revealed, I had always theorized his shrift would be the arrow. Even though that turned out to not be the case, it is great to see that theming permeating his holy form, as Uryu should embody what it truly means to be a traditional Quincy, even when going far beyond what we'd ever known or seen from him before. What I'm getting at is, even with all of his crazy new holy powers, at his core, the crux of the character should continue to embody this idea that all Quincy's use is bows and arrows. I also think the resemblance to a flock of birds is clearly intentional, especially since Uryu's original bows Kojaku and Ginrei Kojaku have sparrow in their name. Anyway, carrying on, Uryu is even capable of creating intricate constructs with the darts, as seen when they surround and imprison Ichigo before Uryu detonates them all at once, creating an explosion in the shape of a Quincy cross. In his duel with Renji, we see that Uryu has developed his control over the darts even more. After releasing the incomplete version of his Volstandig, Uryu conjures several darts before compiling them in an intricate display, transforming them into a gigantic arrow, which he then launches at Renji. Although only made up of seemingly comparatively few darts, this huge arrow devastates the battlefield, punching a massive hole through every building in its wake, leaving behind a trench, a scar in Varvelt itself. Uryu also bombards Renji with hundreds of these darts at once, which completely demolishes his defenses. An additional ability we see from Uryu in the anime is Sternenstaub, which means stardust, wherein Uryu combines all of his currently deployed darts into one enormous blue bow shaped like a Quincy cross. From there, Uryu reaches into the energy of the bow itself to draw a massive arrow back, except it isn't quite that simple. Once Uryu releases the arrow, instead of a traditional arrow, enormous beams of energy are launched from the 5 points of the cross, which together form a massive blast. Again, while it is intricate in the way it looks, while it's unusual, it is still, at its core, a projectile. And while incredibly powerful, as a direct hit from Stern and Staub was capable of holding off Ichigo's Getsuga Juji show for a few seconds, which is impressive, ultimately the attack is repelled by Ichigo's Golden Cross blast and completely dispelled. Interestingly, as Stern and Staub struggles to hold back Getsuga Jujisho, we can see hundreds of individual darts spilling out of the energy star, almost like spent bullets, as though it's literally expending that energy before our eyes. And so it seems like Stern and Staub is quite literally made up of Uryu's flock, and once he runs out of them, the attack dissipates entirely. However, Uryu's most fascinating, and perhaps dangerous, new ability comes at the climax of his duel with Renji. Conjuring a tidal wave of his arrowheads, Uryu unleashes Petachvinda as they rush towards the vice-captain. The darts collect in the air above Renji, forming a Quincy cross as they come together to create 5 interconnected spokes, which then drive themselves into the ground in a pentagonal formation around Renji, boxing him inside. It's almost like a little mini Sprenger, in terms of its visuals anyway, and with Renji trapped and unable to escape, each of the spokes conjures multiple reishi spikes, which then impale the vice-captain, piercing him from all sides before zapping him with a kind of electrical current that brutally and painfully saps his power. Eventually, the gaps between the 5 individual spokes are sealed off entirely by walls of this icy blue light, and inside, poor old Renji is literally spun around as though in a blender, the ability forcefully draining him of strength. Now here's where things get a little weird. Uryu explains what Petachvinda is doing, telling Renji that it has the ability to extract Reiatsu from its target, and that for as long as he remains in its grasp, Petachvinda will continually steal Reiatsu from Renji, eventually leaving him with nothing left. Except, hang on a minute, this moment tells 2 different stories. Uryu initially says that he's extracting Renji's spiritual pressure, in both the sub and the dub. But then in that same explanation, says he's extracting Renji's reishi instead, before then swapping back to spiritual pressure. Of course, spiritual pressure and reishi aren't the same thing at all. And to be honest, I don't really see how extracting someone's spiritual pressure or reiatsu would really have any kind of a deleterious effect. Not to get too technical, but Reiatsu is simply just the effect of power exerted from one's Reryoku, or spirit energy. Reryoku is what's actually important. Reiatsu itself is not a power per se, it's the sensation of one's power felt and reflected upon the world around them. Obviously, someone with more Reryoku can unleash greater Reiatsu because they have more power to expend, but extracting Renji's spiritual pressure doesn't really seem to make sense to me. Now, Uryu also says he's extracting Renji's reishi, which I'm not sure makes a huge amount of sense either, though I think it makes more sense than spiritual pressure. Reishi is literally spirit matter. It's what makes up the spirit worlds of Bleach and the souls within. Quincy's have the unique ability to dominate and bend reishi or matter to their will, so extracting Renji's reishi kind of makes more sense to some degree, but that would also mean that Uryu is carving away Renji's physical being. Honestly, what would make the most sense to me here is of course the terminology they didn't use. The idea that Uryu is literally stealing Renji's Reryoku, not his reishi, not his reiatsu, his spirit energy itself, but that's not what he nor the subtitles seem to say. He even notes that once he's extracted Renji's spiritual pressure, his Shikai and Bankai will lose all power. And again, that seems to fit best with the idea of Uryu stealing Reryoku instead. In my opinion, because without Reryoku, Renji can no longer sustain Shikai or Bankai. And that's what makes Renji's last act so incredible. He forces out a weaker form of his bankai using his raw life force, that actual power that is shared between him and Zabimaru, as they are one and the same. Essentially, his spirit energy tank is totally depleted by Petachvinda. So now he is siphoning off his own life force. He's going into the red to try something last-ditch and desperate. At least that's how I interpreted it. And this is why Renji tells Uryū not to talk like he knows bankai. Because to Uryū, to a Quincy, the idea of using bankai is purely mechanical. If Renji is out of power, if he's out of juice, he won't be able to use bankai. That's as far as Uryū understands it. And on the surface that makes sense, but the bond between a Shinigami and Zanpakuto is deeper than that. They are one and the same, as we know, thanks to the 1000-Year Blood War arc, so it's not a simple matter of how much spirit energy you have left in the tank. Hence why Renji is able to conjure one last move that should defy a Quincy's very cold and logical approach. Anyway, maybe when Uryu says he's extracting Renji's Reiatsu, he means he's extracting his actual spirit energy through his spiritual pressure. Maybe. Either way, this ability is absolutely crazy, and so far is the capstone to everything new that Uryu has received in the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below regarding everything new that Uryu has received in the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime to date. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Which of his new abilities and powers is your favourite? How do you feel about his Quincy Vollstandig? What are you hoping to see from Uryu in Core 4? And how do you feel about these new abilities that we've talked about at the end of this video? How they work? What's going on? I'd love to get all of your thoughts down in the comments below, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. Your support does mean everything. It does help out a lot. As always, a massive thanks to everyone who has checked out the recent videos on the channel. I really do appreciate all of the support there as well. And again, consider checking out my Patreon as well too. Once again, your support there does matter so very much, and I really would appreciate it. You can join everyone who is supporting me over there for as little as $1 a month. The $2 tier is the most popular one, and that's the one that gets you every single one of my videos absolutely free of YouTube ads. But even at the $1 tier, your support is making a material difference. But again, just the fact that you're here watching these videos really is support enough. And again, it doesn't go unnoticed. So thank you all so very much. Alright guys, well, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.